In the early hours of November 19th, 1942, the ground shook. Not from artillery, not from bombing, from something far worse, from the sound of over 1 million Soviet soldiers moving at once, in two directions simultaneously, through a blizzard, across frozen steppe, directly toward the flanks of the German Sixth Army. It was the largest coordinated Soviet offensive since the war began, and the man responsible for defending against it, the man whose job it was to see it coming, prepare for it, and survive it, had been warned. Repeatedly, specifically, by name, by date, by direction. He had ignored every single warning. His name was Friedrich Paulus, and within 72 hours of that November morning, his army of 300,000 men, the pride of the Wehrmacht, the force Hitler had personally directed to capture Stalingrad, would be completely surrounded, trapped in a frozen pocket of Russian earth with no way in and no way out. The encirclement had a name. The Soviets called it Operation Uranus. History would call it the turning point of the Second World War. And at the center of it all was a man who, by almost every account, had known something terrible was coming, and had chosen, again and again, to look away. But this story is not simply about a military disaster. Disasters happen in war. Armies are destroyed. Battles are lost. What makes the story of Friedrich Paulus so enduring, so deeply unsettling, is the question of why. Why does an intelligent man, a meticulous planner, a general with every resource available to him, ignore the warnings that could have saved 1/3 of 1 million lives? Was it arrogance, loyalty, fear, or something far more human and far more dangerous than any of those things? By the time you understand what happened at Stalingrad, you will have your answer, and it will say something uncomfortable, not just about Friedrich Paulus, but about the nature of certainty, obedience, and the catastrophic cost of choosing not to see what is directly in front of you. To understand what Paulus walked into, you have to understand what Stalingrad meant, not strategically, but psychologically. By the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had been going for over a year. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, had initially torn through Soviet defenses with a speed and violence that stunned the world. But Moscow had not fallen. Leningrad had not fallen. The Soviet Union, which Hitler had described as a rotting structure that would collapse at the first kick, had absorbed catastrophic losses and kept fighting. Hitler needed a victory, a real one with a name attached to it. Stalingrad was a city on the Volga River, an industrial hub, a transportation corridor, and, crucially, a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself. Capturing it would be, in Hitler's calculus, both strategically valuable and symbolically devastating. It would cut Soviet supply lines to the south. It would open the path to the Caucasus oil fields Germany desperately needed. And it would humiliate Stalin on the world stage by erasing his name from the map. The city became, in Hitler's mind, something beyond a military objective. It became an obsession. And obsessions, in command structures built around the absolute authority of one man, have a way of filtering downward, distorting every decision, every assessment, every report from the field. Friedrich Paulus was given command of the Sixth Army in January 1942. He was, by reputation, one of the most capable staff officers in the German military, meticulous, detail-oriented, precise. He had helped plan Operation Barbarossa itself. He was the kind of general who slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest studying maps and logistics tables. He was not a reckless man. He was not an impulsive man. He was exactly the kind of man you would want commanding a major offensive operation, which is precisely what makes what followed so difficult to explain. The Sixth Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August 1942. What had been planned as a swift, decisive capture turned almost immediately into something else entirely, a grinding, murderous, block-by-block urban battle that consumed men at a rate that staggered even veteran officers. The Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chukov, had made a calculated decision. They would fight so close to the German lines that German air superiority and artillery would become nearly useless for fear of hitting their own troops. They called it hugging the enemy. The Germans called it hell. By September, Paulus's army was fighting for individual buildings, for floors of buildings, for stairwells and rubble piles and factory workshops that had no names, only numbers on military maps. The Barakati factory, the Krasny Oktyabr factory, the grain elevator, places that would become immortalized in military history not for their strategic value, but for the sheer, incomprehensible human cost of taking or holding them. Men died for rooms. Units were destroyed capturing kitchens. The Sixth Army, which had swept across hundreds of miles of open steppe in weeks, was now measuring its progress in meters and bleeding itself white in the process. And while all of this was happening, while Paulus was feeding division after division into the meat grinder of the city, his flanks were being held by allies. Romanian armies, Italian armies, Hungarian armies, soldiers who were, by every honest assessment, less well-equipped, less experienced, and less motivated than the Wehrmacht units they were replacing. They were covering hundreds of kilometers of front line along the Don River to the north and the open steppe to the south. And they were stretched. Dangerously, obviously, catastrophically stretched. Every German officer with eyes could see it. Several of them said so, loudly and in writing. The warnings began arriving at Paulus's headquarters in October 1942. Intelligence reports noted the buildup of Soviet armor on the other side of the Don. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed columns of tanks and trucks moving south and west, not toward Stalingrad, but toward the flanks. German officers embedded with the Romanian units sent urgent dispatches describing the state of their allied forces: inadequate anti-tank weapons, poor communication infrastructure, low morale, no reserves. General Ferdinand Heim, commanding the German 48th Panzer Corps, one of the only armored formations available to backstop the flanks, raised alarms repeatedly. General Hans Valentin Hube, commanding the 16th Panzer Division, was explicit. The Romanian front could not hold against a major Soviet armored offensive. It was not a matter of courage or will. It was a matter of mathematics. Too few men, too few guns, too much space, against an enemy that was clearly and visibly preparing something large. General Zeitzler, the new army chief of staff in Berlin, was also worried. He reviewed the intelligence assessments and told Hitler directly that the flanks were vulnerable. He was told, in essence, that the Soviets were incapable of mounting such an operation, that they had exhausted themselves fighting in Stalingrad. That German intelligence, which had consistently underestimated Soviet strength for 18 months, could be trusted on this point. It could not be trusted on this point. Here is the detail that makes military historians go quiet when they discuss it. Soviet planning for Operation Uranus had begun in September 1942, while the battle for Stalingrad was still raging. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky personally presented the plan to Stalin on September 13th. The operation was designed from its inception to avoid engaging the strongest German forces directly. Instead, it would strike precisely where German intelligence refused to believe a strike was coming: at the Romanian flanks, at the overextended Allied armies, at the hinges of the entire German position. The Soviets spent 2 months moving forces into position. 1 million men, thousands of tanks, stockpiles of artillery ammunition so vast that Soviet logistics officers would later describe the scale as almost incomprehensible. They moved at night. They maintained strict radio silence. They used the blizzards and the flat, featureless steppe to conceal movements that, in different terrain, might have been visible from miles away. And yet, even with all that concealment, even with all that discipline, German reconnaissance did detect elements of the buildup. Reports came in. Prisoners were taken. Defectors crossed the line with information. A Romanian officer captured on the Don front told his interrogators, matter-of-factly, that a major Soviet offensive was imminent, that the men on the Romanian side of the wire were openly discussing it. The report reached Paulus's headquarters. It was assessed as prisoner misinformation. Why? That is the question that has occupied historians for 80 years. Why did Friedrich Paulus, intelligent, meticulous, careful Friedrich Paulus, look at that accumulating evidence and reach the wrong conclusion every single time? Part of the answer is structural. The Wehrmacht in 1942 was not an organization that rewarded bad news. Officers who reported problems risked being relieved, or worse. Hitler had already sacked multiple senior commanders for retreating without orders, for questioning directives, for failing to maintain the optimism the Führer demanded from his military. The atmosphere at every level of command had been progressively contaminated by the knowledge that telling the truth about the situation could end your career, or in extremis, your freedom. But there is something else, something more personal. Friedrich Paulus was, at his core, a staff officer who had been handed a field command. He had spent his entire career learning to work within command structures, to align his assessments with the priorities of the men above him, to be, above all else, a reliable instrument of policy rather than an independent voice. He was not the kind of general who pounded the table and insisted on being heard. He was the kind of general who found a way to make the orders he was given work. That quality, that flexibility, that loyalty, that professional smoothness, had made him one of the most trusted men in the Wehrmacht. And it was precisely that quality that was about to cost 300,000 men their freedom and tens of thousands their lives. When every instinct and every piece of evidence told him that disaster was imminent, Friedrich Paulus did what he had spent 30 years training himself to do. He aligned himself with the institutional view. He trusted the optimism flowing down from Hitler's headquarters. He told himself the flanks would hold. He kept his focus on the city. He kept feeding men into the rubble. And he waited. November 19th, 1942, 0730 hours. The Soviet artillery opened up along the Romanian Third Army's front on the Don, and the sound of it reached German positions miles away. This was not a harassing barrage. This was not a local counterattack. The ground shook for 80 minutes as thousands of Soviet guns fired simultaneously along a front of dozens of kilometers. And then the tanks came. T-34s by the hundreds, followed by infantry in white winter camouflage, pouring through the gaps the artillery had torn in the Romanian lines. The Romanian Third Army broke within hours. Not from cowardice, from physics. Infantry without adequate anti-tank weapons cannot stop armored formations. The math was what it had always been, what every warning had said it was. The following morning, November 20th, the southern pincer launched. Soviet forces punched through the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad with equal ferocity and equal speed. Two massive armored columns were now driving toward each other, curling around the Sixth Army's position like the hands of a closing vice. On November 23rd, at the small town of Kalak on the Don River, the two Soviet pincers met. The encirclement was complete. 300,000 German and Axis soldiers, Paulus's entire Sixth Army, plus attached units, were now inside a pocket of frozen steppe roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. Outside the pocket, 1 million Soviet soldiers. Inside, men who had been fighting without rest for months, on reduced rations, in temperatures that were dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. Everything that had been warned against had come to pass. Overnight, exactly as predicted. What followed in the next 2 months is one of the most agonizing slow-motion tragedies in the history of warfare. Inside the pocket, Paulus's men waited for relief that was promised and never came, for supply airlifts that delivered a fraction of what was needed, for the miracle that Hitler kept insisting was being organized. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had told Hitler that the Sixth Army could be supplied by air, that his aircraft could deliver the 500 tons of supplies per day the army needed to survive. It was a claim with no basis in mathematical reality. The Luftwaffe stretched across multiple fronts in winter conditions, with inadequate aircraft numbers and airfields being steadily pushed back by Soviet advances, managed on its best days to deliver less than a third of what was needed. On most days, far less. Men inside the pocket began to starve, then to freeze, then to die, not from Soviet bullets, but from cold and hunger and the slow collapse of their bodies in temperatures that made survival itself a form of combat. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein mounted a relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, in December. His armored spearhead drove to within 48 kilometers of the pocket before being halted. 48 kilometers. Close enough that soldiers inside the pocket, on clear nights, claimed they could see the distant glow of signal flares on the horizon. Paulus was urged, by Manstein, by his own staff, by every military logic available, to break out toward the relief force, to fight his way through the Soviet ring while Manstein's tanks held open the corridor. Hitler forbade it. The Sixth Army was to hold its position. It would be relieved. It would not retreat. It would stand. Paulus obeyed. This is the second great question of the Stalingrad story, and it is in some ways even more troubling than the first. By December 1942, the consequences of every ignored warning had come fully, visibly, undeniably true. Paulus was no longer dealing with intelligence reports and threat assessments. He was dealing with reality, stark, brutal, undeniable reality. His men were dying by the thousands from cold and starvation. The promised relief had failed. The airlift was a fiction. The only option that offered any chance of saving his army was to break out, regardless of orders. He had the authority, under German military law, to make that decision. The Wehrmacht's command doctrine, Auftragstaktik, the principle of mission-based command, explicitly gave field commanders the right to deviate from orders when circumstances demanded it. And circumstances had never demanded it more clearly than they did in December 1942, inside that frozen pocket, with 300,000 lives in the balance. But Friedrich Paulus, the man who had spent his career perfecting the art of alignment, could not do it. Could not bring himself to disobey a direct order from the Supreme Commander, could not step outside the structure that had defined him for 30 years and say, "The order is wrong. The situation has changed. I am doing what the men require rather than what I have been told." Other commanders in German military history had done exactly that. Some had been court-martialed for it. Some had been celebrated for it, after the fact, when the decision turned out to be right. Paulus was not that kind of man. He had never been that kind of man. The system had found him, and shaped him, and placed him exactly where his particular combination of competence and compliance could do the most possible damage. He held his position. He followed his orders. He waited. January 1943. The Soviet tightening of the pocket accelerated. German defensive lines collapsed one by one as soldiers too weak from cold and starvation to hold rifles were overrun by fresh Soviet units. The Sixth Army's perimeter shrank daily. Hospitals, if the frozen basements and ruined buildings that served as hospitals could be called that, filled beyond capacity. Frostbite cases exceeded combat casualties. Men who had survived 2 years of the most ferocious war in human history were dying of hunger in their foxholes, still waiting for orders that made sense. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, in a moment of grotesque symbolic timing, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. It was the highest rank in the German military. No German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. The message was as clear as anything Hitler had ever communicated without words. The following day, January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered. He sent a final radio message to Hitler's headquarters. The Sixth Army had fallen, faithful to its oath and conscious of the lofty importance of its mission. Then he walked out of the basement of the ruined Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, in his greatcoat, and surrendered to a Soviet lieutenant young enough to be his son. He was the first German field marshal ever taken alive by an enemy force. The number requires a moment of silence before it can be properly absorbed. Of the approximately 300,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, around 91,000 survived to become prisoners of war. Of those 91,000, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 would eventually return to Germany. Some died of typhus, some of dysentery, some of the accumulated damage of what their bodies had been through, the starvation, the frostbite, the cold that had gotten into them during those months in the pocket and simply never fully left. The last survivors did not return home until 1955, 12 years after the surrender. The families of the Sixth Army, wives, mothers, children across Germany, had spent those same months receiving the official communications that told them nothing useful, the propaganda broadcast that painted the encirclement as a heroic sacrifice, the letters from the pocket that grew increasingly infrequent and then stopped entirely. For many of them, the uncertainty lasted years. The Red Cross had no access. Soviet records were incomplete and inconsistently shared. Some families waited a decade before they received confirmation of what had happened. 300,000 men, most of them gone, because of warnings that were never heeded, options that were never taken, and an order held in obedience past the point where obedience had any moral justification. Friedrich Paulus spent his captivity in Soviet camps and villas. He made a slow, difficult journey toward a particular kind of understanding, testifying at Nuremberg against the Nazi leadership, speaking on Soviet radio calling for German soldiers to surrender, eventually settling in East Germany after his release, and living quietly until his death in 1957. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him in those years, a man who had genuinely reckoned with what had happened, who understood, on some level, the weight of what his decisions had cost. But understanding, when it comes after the fact, after the irreversible damage has been done, occupies a painful and insufficient place. It is not nothing, but it is also not enough. The men who froze in the pocket were not redeemed by their commander's posthumous clarity. The widows who waited for letters that never came were not comforted by his eventual testimony. The 5,000 survivors who came home a decade later came home to a country that had changed beyond recognition, to families that had rebuilt around absence. Understanding, when it arrives too late, is just grief wearing the clothes of wisdom. Military historians have argued for decades about what might have changed if Paulus had acted differently at any of the critical decision points. If he had pressed harder for a defensive redeployment before November 19th. If he had broken out in December when Manstein's relief force was within reach. If he had, even at the last extremity, defied Hitler's field marshal promotion and surrendered weeks earlier, preserving at least some additional fraction of his army's surviving strength. The honest answer is that no one can know. War is not a controlled experiment. History does not run twice. But what the analysts consistently agree on is this: at almost every juncture, there was an option. There was a choice. There was a moment where a different decision was available and could have been made. The catastrophe of Stalingrad was not inevitable in the way that natural disasters are inevitable. It was constructed, decision by decision, warning by warning ignored, option by option left untaken, by human beings operating inside a system that rewarded certain choices and punished others. Friedrich Paulus was not the only person responsible for what happened. Hitler was responsible. Göring was responsible. The entire institutional culture of the Wehrmacht, which had spent years selecting for compliance over judgment, was responsible. But Paulus was the man on the ground. He was the man with the authority. He was the man who received the warnings, read the intelligence, listened to his staff, and chose, repeatedly, to fold those warnings into the broader machinery of obedience. That choice is where this story lives. Not in the grand strategic sweep of the Eastern Front, but in the small, repeated, human moment of a man looking at something he doesn't want to see and deciding, one more time, not to see it. There is something almost universal in that moment. Most people will never command an army. Most people will never face a decision with 300,000 lives attached to it. But most people will, at some point, find themselves in a version of that same position. The warning that arrives and is inconvenient. The evidence that contradicts what they have already committed to believing. The voice from a colleague, a report, an instinct that says something is wrong here, something is coming, you need to change course. And most people will feel, in that moment, the same pull that Friedrich Paulus felt. The pull toward the existing structure, toward the current plan, toward the interpretation of events that doesn't require dismantling what has already been built, doesn't require admitting that the thing you committed to was wrong, doesn't require the discomfort and the exposure of saying out loud, I was wrong and I need to change. That pull has a name in psychology. It has been studied in corporate collapses and medical errors and engineering disasters. The specific mechanism, the way humans process disconfirming evidence not as a signal to update, but as a threat to be neutralized, is one of the most well-documented and most dangerous cognitive patterns in human decision-making. Stalingrad is not unique because it happened. It is historically significant because of the scale. The pattern repeats constantly, in smaller rooms, with lower stakes, with the same essential structure. Warning arrives. Warning is explained away. Disaster follows. Friedrich Paulus was an intelligent man who made catastrophic choices. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because intelligence, without the will to act on inconvenient truths, is not a safeguard. It is just a more sophisticated machine for generating justifications. The ruined Univermag department store in Volgograd, the city that was called Stalingrad and was renamed after the Soviet Union fell, still exists. Tourists visit it. There are exhibits. There are photographs. There are the kinds of carefully constructed memorial spaces that try to make an abstraction called history feel real and present and human. They do their best. The photographs help. The artifacts help. The preserved pieces of wall with bullet holes still in them help. But the number, 300,000 men, resists every attempt to make it fully comprehensible. The human mind was not built to process it. We process it in pieces. One letter home that was never answered. One family that waited a decade. One survivor who came back in 1955 to a street he didn't recognize, to children who had grown up without him, carrying frostbite scars that would stay with him the rest of his life. One man, somewhere in Bavaria, in November 1942, who got a letter from his son saying things were difficult, but he was alive and they should not worry, and then never got another one. On November 19th, 1942, the ground shook. An army of 300,000 men went to sleep inside German lines and woke up surrounded. The warnings had been there. The options had been there. The intelligence, the reconnaissance, the defectors, the Allied officers pleading for reinforcement, all of it had been there. Friedrich Paulus had looked at all of it, had read it, assessed it, filed it, had continued to believe, because it was easier and safer and more structurally comfortable to believe that what he feared would not come to pass. It came to pass anyway. It always does. That is the oldest and most reliable lesson that history offers, repeated in every century, in every theater, in every domain of human endeavor where the stakes are high enough to matter. Reality does not negotiate. It does not wait for the convenient moment. It does not care about your command structure or your career or the ideology you have built your identity around. It arrives on its own schedule, usually faster than expected, usually through the flank you left exposed, usually in the hours before dawn when the ground begins to shake and you realize, finally and too late, that the warnings were not mistaken. They never were.